Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Today I'm talking to Michael Stevens, a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London and a former guest from the Middle East Brief. Hey, Mike, how you doing?
Hi, Aaron. How's it going?
Not too bad, not too bad. I thought today we would get into things that have been happening in your country as it pertains to the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, depending on whichever Gulf you want to use, and about the British maritime mission as it relates to the Iranians.
Sure. It's a complicated story, I think, which is only getting more complicated. And it seems to be a bit of a moving target. I think, as your listeners know, the British and the Iranians have got into a bit of a spat where about a month ago, the British, off the coast of Gibraltar, impounded an Iranian tanker, the Grace 1. It was supposedly sending oil to Syria. And so those cargoes on the tanker were deemed to be in violation of sanctions. It's not quite clear exactly which sanctions, but nevertheless, the supreme leader of Iran promised a response, and we got a response. And about a week later, the Stena Impero, which is a British flag tanker, was diverted, shall we say, off course outside of the waters of Oman into Iranian territory and impounded. And now we have a bit of a Mexican standoff. Nobody seems to be quite clear how to move this situation forward. And as a result, the British have been, I think, pretty upset. And they've been looking at ways in which they can beef up security in the area. There was a British ship near the Stena Impero at the time that the Iranians fast roped down from a helicopter, the Montrose. But the problem, I think, is not so much this debate about how many ships we have in the area and how much we had in comparison to when Britannia ruled the waves, but actually what we could have done under the conditions and rules of engagement which exist in the Gulf. And actually, I think there's been a bit of politicized debate about defense expenditure and not about what types of capabilities we need in the Gulf and how. But nevertheless, I think it is pretty clear that the UK is going to be doing more in terms of protecting maritime routes in and out of the Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz, and is trying to get other people alongside to do more as well. That includes the Europeans. Primarily, I think that the French, the Danes, the Dutch, we'd love, I think, the Germans to be getting involved as well, but the Europeans are dragging their feet on this. And it now looks after some great promise of a European mission to protect Gulf shipping that actually it's just Britain and America, which has a funny ring to it, doesn't it, Aaron? I seem to remember a few times where Britain and America have charged into the region headlong. But obviously this is slightly different in the sense that there is a developed security architecture in the Gulf, which is US-led and US-dominated anyway. But the Brits have certainly become a greater part of that, and I think in the next few months we'll be doing more. So we're seeing an escalation, absolutely no doubt in my mind we're seeing an escalation. And probably, I'm afraid to say, quite a difficult few months ahead.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to sort of unpack that a little bit because it's taken place, in your country over two different prime ministers, albeit from the same party. So there's a little bit of different dynamics as it pertains to the U.S. here. And also the Iran question is that, despite the overlapping security ties between the United States and the United Kingdom and the sort of shared interest in protecting shipping in the Gulf, the two countries, I would say, are not completely aligned on how they view sort of the totality of the Iran problem. Now, here I'm talking about the nuclear deal.
Right. I mean, I'd agree with that. I think we have made it pretty clear over the last 18 to 24 months, including when Prime Minister Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, that we didn't agree with the US approach to the nuclear deal, that we did support the JCPOA, that we did think that this was a good way to constrain Iran's nuclear enrichment activity. We had, just as the same as the Americans, concerns about Iran's regional role in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, what it's doing with the Houthis in Yemen. By no means, I think, is there a position in London that Iran is not a challenge, particularly with regards to its regional position. But certainly on the nuclear deal, and of course the E3 position in general, that is Paris and Germany, and also some other European countries. So we're pretty keen to keep this deal alive. They were keen to set up a special purpose vehicle whereby Iran could conduct legitimate transactions for certain goods and services that were not in violation of what we thought constituted the deal, which would allow some normality for Iran and its economy. But of course, I think that was always going to be wishful thinking. My view is that the E3 position has got much weaker as the US has tightened the screws on Iran. And as a result, I think what we're seeing now is the US becoming the ultimate arbiter of where the nuclear deal goes. And at some point, although maybe not this year, but at some point, I think all of the Europeans will have to acknowledge that the JCPOA is gone and that there will need to be some sort of reformulation of the deal. Now, I don't know what that looks like, because the problem that we have, and actually to use the words of Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary, if you don't like the deal, tell us what you do like. Tell us what you do want. And I think that's the problem with this maximum pressure strategy, as we perceive it certainly here, is that, yes, okay, we accept, or the UK accepts that there are some issues to do with the implementation of the deal and the fact that it does seem to have given Iran a sort of emboldened stance across the region. But actually on the technicalities, what is it that you want? What types of levels of low enriched uranium will you accept? What centrifuge activity will you accept occurring in Iran? What type of levels of inspections will be acceptable for the United States? And this is the problem, I think, is that no one quite knows what that looks like. But at the same time, as the maximum pressure strategy has ramped up, I think it's fair to say Iran's behavior has got a lot worse. They are misbehaving. There are numerous accusations of IRGC affiliates mining oil tankers, impounding oil tankers, empowering the Houthis to target infrastructure inside Saudi Arabia, providing reconnaissance equipment to Shia militias in Iraq to facilitate those attacks as well. So there's a lot of things going on where I think Iran is behaving pretty badly as a result of the maximum pressure strategy, and that has to be dealt with, regardless of what we think about the JCPOA and the US position.
And I think that brings us back to sort of the trading of the taking of two tankers. You've almost had like a marrying of the two issues, i.e., you had British action in Gibraltar to impound a tanker ostensibly because of sanctions on Syria, but then the Iranian counter was to take a British flagged tanker in the Gulf, which brings sort of more Western naval power into the Persian Gulf in ways that are like de-linked from Syria, if you know what I'm saying. Yeah. And so you're having things that are coming together. So do you think that the Iranians have are they overplaying their hands here a little bit, and are their efforts to try and drive a wedge between the US and the Europeans over the nuclear deal and to keep sort of the regional issues separate beginning to break down as they try and break out from the maximum pressure strategy?
So here's the thing. Obviously, at any point short of military confrontation, Iran will always retain, I think, first mover advantage when it comes to escalation. They are able to twist and tweak in all sorts of different ways that are irritating to Western states, but don't probably elicit a military response. And that includes, of course, the shooting down of a US drone about a month ago as well, which led to a very high period of tension. And I think the US response at that moment has, I think, signaled to Iran that there's a lot that they can get away with. And as a result, I think that the Iranians were emboldened slightly. Now, I'm not saying I supported a US military response to that drone shoot down, but it certainly did tell the Iranians that there was a larger bandwidth to play with, right, within which you could escalate and you could play games, or you can impound tankers, and there wouldn't be some form of military response. But at the same time, it's as you say, the response has to be more maritime policing in the Gulf and patrols in the Gulf. Even the Chinese today are starting to talk about they might, and the key word here is might, begin to put in naval assets to protect their own ships. Now, this is quite unusual because the Chinese have usually freeloaded off Western power in the Gulf, even though they're the ones that are exporting the most oil from the area. So that's very interesting that it's starting to draw in larger, players, people who are interested for more economic reasons. Japan, South Korea, the Australians are also looking at ways that they can contribute. But ultimately, at the moment, what we're looking at is basically a US led, with the UK sticking quite closely in behind, military operation, or at least naval patrol operation, which can only do one thing, which is to constrain Iran's activities at the regional level and at the tactical level. I think that the Iranians will have to get used to the fact that there is just going to be more hardware in the Gulf, and that is a fact of life. The French, I think, will also want to play a role in this, whether they do it through their own basing structure in Abu Dhabi or whether they join up to what the US is doing out of Bahrain, is probably a dynamic which will play out over the next few months. Ultimately, here is the deal. Increasing numbers of states understand that there is a problem with Iran's behavior as it pertains to tactical escalations and problems with its decisions when it comes to disrupting shipping activity. My view is that does undermine the strategy that the Iranians had, which was to try and keep the Europeans separate from the American position. Now, even today, you've got the Germans, who are desperately not wanting to get too close to the American orbit, so they're not going to commit ships to this mission because they don't want to be too closely tied into the United States. But I see no other way, Aaron. I really think that as we're moving towards the back end of this year, that the US will become the most dominant player in this conversation, when it actually wasn't the most dominant player. And that is for a number of reasons. There is a larger consensus that Iran does need to be dealt with from a position of strength. And this German position in particular, that you talk to the Iranians while they behave like this, I believe is becoming undermined. So, Tehran might feel that it looks strong. It might feel that it has the one-upmanship here in terms of escalation. But in the medium term, I don't think it's going to look so good for them.
I mean, how is this playing back out in London? I just happened to be in Scotland on vacation when this happened, but as this played out, and as I was watching, BBC, at the outset of this, there was very much an effort to draw a distinction between, what the U.S. had done in response to the mining of international vessels off the coast of the UAE, basically at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz or in the Gulf of Oman, which was to create, or at least to try and stand up, an international maritime mission. So when there was the separate incident, linked to the taking of the British flag tanker, the response from London was really to try and draw a line between the two, even if they were both towards the same ends. But now they have come together, and I'm curious if you could explain how that dynamic took place. And of course, you had a change in prime minister that may have contributed to that. But you had written in More on the Rocks, and it's a great piece, and we'll link it below, is from the outset, you thought that this was inevitable, even at the outset of the British response, where the idea was to try and keep it separate, even if they were complementary to one another, the two responses.
Right, exactly. And look, let me put my hand up here and say I'm not sure that the way in which we've played our response to the tanker incident has been the best. And I don't think it's helped that in the middle of that, we've had a leadership election and, Boris Johnson has come to power. But here is where I think we've got it slightly wrong, which is that we went charging forward into this escalation with Iran. We should have laid a firmer groundwork for getting the Europeans on side with us before we then started, sending our own ships. And of course, the moment that the Grace 1 was impounded in Gibraltar, we already acknowledged that there would be a response from Iran. We began to think about ways in which we could beef up our own presence. So HMS Duncan was sent out to complement HMS Montrose. There will be more ships coming in the future. But I think what we should have done is a better job of securing European goodwill. We've not really done that. And as a result, what we're doing is kind of tacking back to a position now where we're not basically laying the groundwork for a European flotilla. We're effectively beefing up what is a US military-led presence and then trying to get others on board with that. And I think that the reason why that's gone the direction it has is I think we've probably not invested in our diplomacy quite as much as we should have, because some of our system is obviously distracted by trying to deal with the tanker incident by itself. I think we will at some point do a deal with Iran over this tanker. Quite where the tanker goes is up to anyone's guess, because the problem is, of course, that oil inside the Grey Swan cannot benefit any sanctioned entities. So if we send it back to Iran, for example, that would be benefiting potentially the IRGC, which is a sanctioned entity. So therefore, can we send it back to Iran? No, we probably can't. It's obviously not going to go to Syria. So what do we do with it? We have to find out how to do this, and we're going to have to coordinate with the Iranians, quietly over that, and eventually get our own tanker back. And that's one aspect of the problem. I think both sides need to come out of that not losing face. We certainly don't want to be looking like we're being bullied into any position here. So there's that issue. The response to that, of course, is to look stronger and to increase our presence in the Gulf, to make it look like we aren't backing down. The problem that we've got there is, of course, the immediacy of the response meant that we had to send ships quickly, and we probably didn't really have the time to coordinate with allies in the way that we should have. So we are a little bit out in front alone here, but of course, we've coordinated well with the United States before, and we will do so again. And that has sort of led to us fudging what looks to me an operation that actually is a bit like Operation Sentinel, which we initially did not want to be part of. And what's interesting, of course, is that this new operation, which has been announced this week, is not Op Sentinel. So I'm not quite sure what it is. It seems like
they changed the name.
Right, they've changed the name. The idea, I think, is that it doesn't look the same as what was proposed 2 weeks ago. But I think you and I both know, and your listeners know, that it is basically the same, but it has a wider scope and an international scope. And hopefully we can get somewhere with that. I think in general, look, this pattern of escalation from Iran has led to, obviously, we've been drawn into this. That was our decision. I think I want to make it very clear for the listeners of your podcast that this was not the US telling the British what to do in the case of Gibraltar. We did make a decision. That was a decision that we decided to inform the Americans about, and we faced the consequences of that, relatively speaking, alone. As Mike Pompeo made clear, it is our responsibility to protect our ships. We chose to make that escalation off Gibraltar, and we bound to that. That was not, and I think this was misunderstood by many people, some sort of American instruction to Great Britain to go ahead and do it. That was something we decided to enforce. So here's the thing. I think that there is a general reading of Iran's behavior as problematic, but because we are now directly affected by it, bilaterally and multilaterally, and within the context of the nuclear deal going south, these issues have begun to blur together. And if I'm really, really critical of our position, I don't think there's been enough done to really keep the tracks separate. And as a result, because it's a lack of time, we're in kind of the holiday season here as well. It's August. But also, I think just because we're quite distracted with Brexit and a change of government, that we've not been able to sort of keep the different files separate, and actually slowly but surely we're sort of merging into what looks to me more of a US-led position. I don't know how we're going to keep a JCPOA track alive. And personally, I think that our leverage with France and Germany is a little bit less as a result of what's happened in the last month. That may not be a bad thing. There are many people who don't believe that the JCPOA is a good framework, but let's see what the US comes up with. But I think, if I come back to my original point, it's that the UK was forced into a rushed escalation here, and it's just lucky that we've found a larger operation to work within, and I think that's going to be what we're going to be seeing in the next, I would say, year to 5 years. The Gulf will be more militarized for quite a long time. We just have to accept that that's the new reality.
Yeah, and I think pivoting here, sort of the final point. Just curious is, people will want to know, what sort of options for de-escalation exist. I actually agree with you. It is that the maritime footprint in the Gulf will get larger. The U.S. maximum pressure campaign will certainly be a fixture of the Trump administration. So at least until January 2021, and perhaps longer after that. Depending on how American voters go in November 2020. And even if you have an incoming Democratic administration, somebody who, all of the major candidates here in the U.S. has pledged in some way to re-enter the JCPOA, I personally think that's going to be a lot harder than simply making a declaratory statement on the campaign website.
Yeah.
So where's this going?
Hmm.
Even if you get some sort of change in rhetorical U.S. policy,
Hmm.
undoing the
Hmm.
actions of the past 4 years, or possibility doubling down on the actions of the past 4 years,
Yeah.
suggests that you were in a fundamentally different place than you were in 2016.
Yeah, we are. And we're also in a different place from where we were in 2014, 15, right? So here's the thing, two very immediate differences. In terms of uh, diplomatic tracks with Iran, the US is very open about the fact that it's talking to Iran. Rand Paul is talking to the Iranians. That is a channel which exists and it's acknowledged. Now, does that connect back to the White House? I think it's questionable, but Rand Paul seems to have a lot of scope to explore ways to de-escalate with the Iranians. We also have a parallel track with Emmanuel Macron leading it in France. So the Iranians are openly talking to protagonists, shall we say, which I think does allow for at least some misunderstandings to be cleared up and for there to be less likely, wild escalations which turn to violence. I think that that does ameliorate tension somewhat. So it's good that we've got these acknowledged tracks which exist. It's not like what it was, back in the days when U.S. diplomats, John Kerry, for example, would go to Muscat and meet the Iranians secretly. That's not happening. Um, we were also talking to the Iranians. I mean, I don't think that's a great secret either. So there's plenty of people talking to Iran. I mean, the question is, who are you talking to in Iran, and do they have any leverage? Talking to Zarif, is that the guy that you want to be talking to? And my answer would probably be no. You want to have direct tracks up to either the IRGC or the Supreme Leader himself. So here, I think we've got these sort of slightly weird policy tracks which don't actually impact policy, but at least people are talking. The second thing I think we have to bear in mind is that Iran is just in a much, much stronger regional position than it was in 2010 or even 2015. And I just don't know how we roll that back. You look at somewhere like Iraq, which is heavily reliant on Iranian gas exports to power its infrastructure and its power grid. The US is just going to have to accept that unless Iraq wants to have no electricity or massive shortages for 6 months of the year, that Iranian gas is going to be bought. So, that relationship is going to exist. Same with Bashar al-Assad. Your speciality, northeast Syria. John Bolton was talking about using northeast Syria as a foil against Iranian expansion. Well, it may well be now that the SDF turns and does a deal with Bashar al-Assad, in which case, what does your Iran strategy look like? From my perspective, I think that the Iranians are in quite a strong position. Now, I've talked to many people in the US, in Europe, the Israelis, who all think, oh, well, Iran's lashing out because it's weak. Actually, I think Iran's in a fairly stable position. I'm not any Iranian economic expert, but I, from cursory reading, know that they're hurting a little bit, but I don't see any potential for the regime to be unstable. So my view is that actually, let's ask a fundamental question here. Has the maximum pressure strategy resulted in any changes for the better in Iranian regional behavior? Actually, no. The maximum pressure strategy has made Iranian behavior far, far worse. So where do we go? Well, we're in a catch-22 because if you start to lessen the pressure, it makes it look like you're backing down in the face of Iranian bad behavior, which you can't do. So let's just say you escalate the maximum pressure strategy. Britain's on board, the French are on board, some Europeans. Iran will likely escalate its bad behavior, in which case, what does that escalation look like in Iraq, in Lebanon, potentially with Israel? I don't see a good way out. I really don't. I don't think we're headed for a war. I'm far more sanguine about the prospects for conflict than I was perhaps 10 weeks ago. There have been some headaches like this tanker issue between Great Britain and Iran, but ultimately I don't think anyone's going to go to war. I think that, as you well know, the red line is dead US servicemen or dead Iranian servicemen. No one seems to have crossed that line, which is positive. But I think we're in a holding pattern here. I don't think that there is going to be any big breakthrough on the nuclear deal anytime soon. And I think on the regional file, the US maximum pressure strategy is going to be maintained. I think it's going to continue while ever the Trump administration is in power. Pompeo believes in it. The 12 demands are there on the table, and the Americans are sticking by them. Whether the Democrats come in or not is another matter, but I think you're absolutely right. Look, a Democratic administration cannot just jump straight back into the JCPO. It's not that simple. It's highly partisan, and the Iranians won't believe it. They'll see it as temporary. It's not going to go very far. So in my view, we are just going to have to accept that the new norm is increased tensions across the region, but specifically in the Gulf. The one positive I would say about that is that everybody knows how escalation in the Gulf roughly looks, because since the 1980s, we've been at this game, the Americans, the Iranians, the British, the French, the Emiratis. So there is kind of a pattern, there is an understanding there. And if that's the area where the escalation is, then it's probably good for Yemenis, it's good for Iraqis, probably good for Syrians. Not so good for nuclear enrichment questions. I would hope that the JCPOA track opens up sometime in the new year, but I'm not confident that it will. So this is where we're at. Everybody welcome to having to spend more money on defense and security in the Gulf region, which may be very, very positive if you're BAE Systems or you're Lockheed Martin or someone like that. But in terms of strategic thinking, we're in a bit of a Mexican standoff here.
Yeah, couldn't agree more on the maximum pressure, but on the maximum pressure strategy outcomes and Iran's, I'd say, expansionary attitudes from a position of strength rather than weakness. But with that, I think we're going to have to leave it because we're coming to the end of our time. Michael, as always, it's good for you to join the show.
Thanks so much, Aaron.
And thank you, everybody, for listening.